Morning sun cast long shadows across the military academy's pristine courtyard as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood at rigid attention, her uniform immaculate despite the tremor in her hands that she fought desperately to conceal. Before her loomed Colonel Harrison Blake, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, known throughout the base for his unwavering discipline, his intolerance for weakness, and his particular disdain for what he called soft excuses from softer soldiers. Sarah had been dreading this moment for weeks. The mandatory physical fitness assessment was scheduled for 600 hours, and she knew that her request for accommodation would be met with the colonel's trademark, skepticism. Her hands, wrapped in flesh-colored compression gloves that she hoped would go unnoticed, gripped the formal request letter she had spent 3 sleepless nights composing and recomposing. "So, Lieutenant Martinez," Colonel Blake's voice cut through, the crisp morning air like a blade, his steel-gray eyes scanning her from head to toe with the precision of a military inspection. "I've received your interesting request for modified physical training requirements." He held up the letter between 2 fingers as if it were contaminated, his weathered face twisted into a sneer that had intimidated countless soldiers before. Her. Limited upper body exercises, alternative rope climbing methods, modified push-up positions. He paused dramatically, letting each word hang in the air like an accusation. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what exactly makes you so special that you believe you deserve different treatment from every other soldier on this base?" The colonel began to pace in front of her, his polished boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. His uniform was adorned with ribbons and commendations that spoke of decades of service, of battles fought and won, of a man who had earned his position through blood, sweat, and unwavering determination. Behind him, other officers had begun to gather, some out of curiosity, others drawn by the colonel's raised voice and the promise of witnessing one of his legendary dressing downs. "I've been in the military for 28 years, Martinez," Blake continued, his voice rising with each word. "I've seen soldiers who lost limbs in combat return to active duty without complaint. I've witnessed men and women overcome obstacles that would break civilians, push through pain that would hospitalize the weak-willed. And here you stand before me, whole and healthy in appearance, asking for special treatment because of what? A little discomfort? Some minor inconvenience?" Sarah's jaw clenched as she maintained her position of attention, her eyes fixed straight ahead on a point beyond the colonel's shoulder. She had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed her responses, but the colonel's words still cut deep. The other soldiers watching began to murmur among themselves, some nodding in agreement with their commanding officer, others shifting uncomfortably, as they witnessed what was clearly becoming a public humiliation. "You know what I think, Lieutenant?" Blake stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the deep lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting against desert suns and Arctic winds. "I think you're trying to game the system. I think you're looking for an easy way out, a shortcut that real soldiers don't get to take. I've seen your type before, young officers who think they can charm their way out of the hard work, who believe that a few pretty words on paper will excuse them from the same standards that apply to everyone else." The gathering crowd had grown, larger now, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her like physical weights. Some faces showed sympathy, but many others reflected the colonel's skepticism. She had always been a model soldier, top of her class in officer candidate school, exemplary service record, commendations for leadership and tactical thinking. But none of that seemed to matter now as she stood before this man who had already judged her and found her wanting. "The military isn't a daycare center, Martinez." Blake's voice had taken on a mocking tone that made several of the watching soldiers wince. "We don't coddle our officers because they have delicate sensibilities or minor aches and pains. Every soldier deals with discomfort, with challenges, with situations that test their limits. That's what makes us strong, what forges us into the warriors our country needs." He gestured broadly to the assembled crowd. Look around you. Do you see anyone else asking for special treatment? Do you see any other officers requesting modified duties because they're too fragile for standard requirements?" Sarah's hands had begun to shake more noticeably now, the compression gloves doing little to hide the tremors that ran through her fingers like electrical currents. The colonel's words were designed to break her down, to make her withdraw her request and slink away in shame. She could feel tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Perhaps," Blake continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you'd prefer a desk job, something nice and safe where you won't have to worry about straining yourself? Maybe we should transfer you to the personnel office where the most dangerous thing you'll encounter is a paper cut." The crowd chuckled at his joke, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The colonel turned to address his audience, playing to them like a performer on a stage. "This is what's wrong with the military today, soldiers. Too many young officers who think they can negotiate their way out of excellence, who believe that standards should be lowered to accommodate their personal comfort levels. In my day, we understood that being a soldier meant sacrifice, meant pushing through whatever life threw at you without complaint or excuse." He spun back to face Sarah, his expression now one of open contempt. "So, tell me, Lieutenant Martinez, what's your excuse? What terrible hardship has befallen you that you can't perform the same exercises that 18-year-old recruits manage without difficulty? What catastrophic injury or condition are you hiding beneath that pristine uniform that makes you so much more fragile than the rest of us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah knew that this was her moment of decision. She could continue to endure his mockery, could try to explain in words that would never be enough, or she could show him the truth that she had spent years hiding. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a caged bird as she weighed her options, knowing that whatever she chose would change everything. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard where more than 50 soldiers had gathered to witness what they assumed would be the public humiliation and probable dismissal of another soft officer. The colonel stood before her with his arms crossed, his face a mask of smug satisfaction as he waited for her response, certain that he had cornered her into admitting that her request was nothing more than an attempt to avoid hard work. But Sarah Martinez had secrets beneath her uniform that would silence every mocking voice in that courtyard, scars that told a story of courage and sacrifice that would make even Colonel Blake's distinguished service record pale in comparison. The question was whether she was ready to reveal them to the world. For a long moment that stretched like eternity, Sarah stared into Colonel Blake's mocking eyes, feeling the weight of 50 pairs of watching gazes boring into her. The compression gloves on her hands felt suddenly tight, constricting, like the lies she had been living for the past 3 years. Her breathing had become shallow, not from fear of the colonel's intimidation, but from the memories that his cruel words had unleashed, memories she had fought so hard to bury beneath layers of normalcy and professional competence. "You want to know what's beneath this uniform, Colonel?" Sarah's voice cut through the morning air with a clarity that surprised even her. The tremor that had plagued her hands seemed to steady as she reached for the zipper of her regulation jacket. "You want to see what makes me different from every other soldier standing in this courtyard?" Colonel Blake's sneer faltered slightly at the unexpected shift in her tone. Where moments before had stood a trembling lieutenant accepting his verbal assault, now stood a woman whose eyes had taken on the steel-gray hardness of someone who had looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. The watching crowd sensed the change too, their murmurs dying away as an electric tension filled the air. "You think I'm asking for special treatment because I'm soft, Colonel Blake?" Sarah's hands moved to her jacket buttons with deliberate precision, each movement causing her compression gloves to strain against scars that ran like hidden rivers beneath the fabric. "You think I want an easy way out because I lack the dedication and sacrifice that real soldiers possess?" She began to unbutton her jacket slowly, methodically, her eyes never leaving the colonel's face. 3 years ago, I wasn't lieutenant. Martinez standing in this comfortable courtyard, requesting modified training exercises. 3 years ago, I was Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, deployed with the 2nd Infantry Division in Afghanistan, leading a convoy escort mission through the Kandahar province. The colonel's expression had begun to change, the cruel satisfaction in his eyes giving way to something else, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or the beginning of unease. Behind him, the assembled soldiers had fallen completely silent, sensing that they were about to witness something far more significant than a routine disciplinary action. "Maybe you remember the news reports, Colonel," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "October 15th, 3 years ago, a convoy of supply trucks heading to Forward Operating Base Chapman, an IED explosion that destroyed the lead vehicle and left the remaining trucks vulnerable to Taliban fighters positioned in the surrounding hills." She paused, letting the date settle in the minds of her audience. Several of the older soldiers had indeed begun to show signs of recognition, their faces pale with growing understanding. Sarah's jacket fell open, revealing the crisp white undershirt. Beneath, but more importantly, revealing the way the fabric pulled and stretched over areas where skin and muscle had been rebuilt, where surgeons had worked miracles to put a human being back together. "The explosion killed my driver instantly," she continued, her voice now carrying the weight of survivor's guilt that she had carried for 3 years. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, 22 years old, married just 6 months before deployment. He died because I chose that route, because I made the tactical decision that put us in the path of that bomb. Colonel Blake had gone completely still, now his arms falling to his sides as the pieces of the story began to fall into place. Several soldiers in the crowd had removed their caps in a gesture of respect, recognizing the name and the incident from military news reports and after-action reviews that had circulated through the Army's communication networks. "But the explosion was just the beginning," Sarah said, her hands now working at the buttons of her undershirt. "When the shooting started, when the Taliban fighters opened fire from their concealed positions, I had a choice to make. Stay in cover and call for backup while my soldiers were pinned down and dying, or expose myself to enemy fire to coordinate our defense and evacuate the wounded." She pulled her undershirt up, revealing her torso to the shocked gasps of the assembled crowd. What they saw was a roadmap of surgical reconstruction, a testament to the skill of military doctors and the resilience of human flesh. Scars crisscrossed her abdomen and chest like spider webs, some thin and precise from surgical incisions, others broad and angry where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. Her left side showed clear evidence of massive trauma. Skin grafts that had never quite matched her natural tone, areas where ribs had been rebuilt, places where organs had been repositioned and repaired. 7 bullets, Sarah said calmly, pointing to various scars with clinical precision. 3 from AK-47 rounds that went clean through, 4 that had to be surgically removed along with fragments of my own ribs and pieces of Sergeant Rodriguez's dog tags, which had been blown into my chest by the explosion. She traced a particularly prominent scar that ran from just below her left breast to her lower abdomen. "This one nicked my spleen and collapsed my left lung. The doctors weren't sure I'd ever breathe normally again, let alone return to active duty." The silence in the courtyard was now complete and profound. Colonel Blake's face had drained of all color, his earlier confidence and swagger evaporating like morning mist. Several soldiers had tears running down their cheeks as they stared at the evidence of sacrifice and courage that stood before them in the form of their fellow officer. "But I kept fighting," Sarah continued, her voice never wavering despite the emotional weight of her revelation. "For 47 minutes, I coordinated air support, directed evacuation of the wounded, and maintained defensive positions while bleeding out on Afghan soil. I saved 11 soldiers that day, Colonel Blake. 11 men and women who went home to their families because I chose to expose myself to enemy fire rather than hide in safety." She turned slightly, revealing her back to the crowd, and the gasps that had greeted her front wounds were nothing compared to the sounds of shock and horror that escaped from the watching soldiers now. Her back was a canvas of surgical scars, burn marks, and skin grafts that spoke of injuries so severe that her survival bordered on miraculous. The compression gloves she wore made perfect sense now. Her hands bore the evidence of severe burns from the explosion, nerve damage that left them with limited sensation and constant pain. The burns covered 60% of my body, Sarah explained, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone who had recited these facts to doctors and therapists countless times. Third-degree burns on my hands, arms, and back from the initial explosion. The surgeries to repair the damage took 18 months, followed by another year of physical therapy to regain basic motor functions. She held up her gloved hands, flexing fingers that moved with obvious difficulty and discomfort. "I'll never have full sensation in my hands again, Colonel. The nerve damage is permanent. Simple tasks like buttoning my uniform or holding a weapon require concentration and effort that normal people can't imagine." She began to slowly button her shirt back up, covering the evidence of her ordeal with the same methodical precision she had shown in revealing it. "So when I request modified physical training requirements, Colonel Blake, it's not because I'm soft or looking for special treatment. It's because standard push-ups put pressure on nerve damage that sends lightning bolts of pain through my arms. It's because rope climbing requires grip strength and hand sensation that I simply don't possess anymore. It's because I have metal plates holding my ribs together and scar tissue that limits my range of motion in ways that civilian doctors are still trying to understand." Colonel Blake stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his earlier words of mockery and derision hanging in the air like accusations against his own character. The crowd of soldiers around them had begun to disperse quietly, many of them unable to meet Sarah's eyes, ashamed of their earlier amusement at what they had assumed was the humiliation of a weak officer. "I earned my commission, Colonel," Sarah said as she zipped up her jacket, once again concealing the evidence of her sacrifice beneath the pristine exterior of a model officer. "I earned it while lying in a hospital bed, studying military tactics and leadership principles between surgeries and skin grafts. I earned it by refusing to accept medical retirement, by fighting through pain and disability to prove that I could still serve my country and lead soldiers." Her eyes met his directly now, and Colonel Blake saw in them the kind of steel that is forged only in the crucible of combat and survival. "I'm not asking for special treatment, sir. I'm asking for the accommodation I need to continue serving alongside soldiers who have never been tested the way I have been tested, who have never sacrificed what I have sacrificed, and who have never proven their dedication to this uniform, the way I proved mine on that October day in Afghanistan." The courtyard had grown so quiet that the sound of the morning breeze rustling through the nearby trees seemed unnaturally loud. Colonel Blake opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Again, his decades of military bearing and authority suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of Sarah's quiet dignity and undeniable courage. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of a flag snapping in the wind and the barely audible whisper of someone in the crowd saying, "Jesus Christ," under their breath. Colonel Blake stood frozen, in place, his weathered face cycling through expressions of shock, shame, and something that might have been recognition. For the first time in his 28-year career, the man who had built his reputation on unwavering confidence and decisive action found himself completely, utterly speechless. It was then that Major Patricia Hendricks, the base's intelligence officer, stepped forward from the crowd. Her face was pale but determined as she moved to stand beside Sarah, her own service ribbons catching the morning light. "Colonel Blake," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard with crystal clarity, "perhaps you'd like to know that Lieutenant Martinez is also the recipient of the Silver Star, the Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Combat Action Badge." She paused, letting each honor sink in before continuing. The citation for her Silver Star specifically mentions her extraordinary heroism under fire and her refusal to abandon her post despite life-threatening injuries. The colonel's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Behind Major Hendricks, other officers began to step forward as well, forming a loose semicircle of support around their fellow soldier. Captain James Morrison, a veteran of Iraq, removed his cap entirely as he spoke. Sir, with respect, Lieutenant Martinez didn't just save 11 soldiers that day. 3 of them were my former squad mates from my previous deployment. She's the reason Staff Sergeant Williams was able to walk his daughter down the aisle last month. The revelation seemed to physically stagger Colonel Blake, who took a half-step backward as if he'd been struck. His hands, which had been so steady and assured during his verbal assault, now trembled slightly at his sides. The crowd of watching soldiers had begun to shift and murmur, but not with the earlier amusement at Sarah's perceived weakness. Now, their voices carried tones of respect, admiration, and more than a little shame at having initially sided with the colonel's mockery. Sarah remained at attention throughout this show of support, her expression unchanged, her posture perfect despite the obvious pain that standing rigidly for so long was causing her damaged body. The compression gloves on her hands had darkened with perspiration, and those close enough to see could notice the slight tremor in her fingers that spoke of nerve damage and constant discomfort. Yet she endured, as she had endured everything else life had thrown at her. Colonel Blake's voice cracked slightly as he finally managed to speak, the single word barely audible in the hushed courtyard. He cleared his throat and tried again, his usual commanding tone replaced by something smaller, more human. I did not have access to your complete service record, Lieutenant. The excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears, and he seemed to recognize this as his shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. Major Hendricks stepped closer to the colonel, her voice low but still audible to those nearby. Sir, perhaps that's because Lieutenant Martinez has never sought recognition for her service. She's never mentioned her decorations in casual conversation, never used her combat record to advance her career or gain favorable treatment. She simply continued to serve, to lead, and to excel, despite carrying injuries that would have sent most soldiers into comfortable medical retirement. The Major's words hit their target with surgical precision, and Colonel Blake winced as if physically struck. Around the courtyard, the gathered soldiers began to disperse more quickly now, many of them unable to meet Sarah's eyes, others shooting dark looks at their commanding officer. The morning's events had fundamentally shifted the dynamics of respect and authority on the base, and everyone present seemed to understand that nothing would ever be quite the same again. But it was what happened next that would become the most talked about moment in the base's history, a story that would be retold in barracks and mess halls for years to come. Slowly, with the deliberate precision that had marked his entire military career, Colonel Blake raised his right hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute. The gesture was not the casual acknowledgement that officers typically exchanged, but the deep, respectful salute reserved for fallen heroes and Medal of Honor recipients. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, he said, his voice now steady but thick with emotion. I formally apologize for my conduct this morning. Your request for training modifications is not only approved, but will be implemented immediately. He held the salute for a long moment, his steel-gray eyes now bright with what might have been unshed tears. It would be my honor to personally ensure that your training accommodations are tailored to allow you to continue serving at the highest levels of military excellence. Sarah's return salute was crisp and professional, despite the obvious difficulty her damaged hands had in maintaining the proper position. Thank you, sir, she replied simply, her voice betraying none of the emotional turmoil that the morning's events must have stirred within her. As the salutes were dropped and the formal moment ended, Colonel Blake took a step closer to Sarah, lowering his voice so that only she and the nearest officers could hear. Lieutenant, I've spent my entire career believing that I understood what makes a soldier strong, what separates the warriors from the weak. Today, you've taught me that I still have much to learn about courage and sacrifice." He paused, his jaw working as he struggled with words that clearly didn't come easily. Would you be willing to share your story with our officer development program? I think there are lessons in your experience that could benefit every leader on this base." The request hung in the air between them, and Sarah studied the colonel's face for a long moment before responding. This man who had publicly humiliated her just minutes before was now asking her to help train other officers, to share the most painful experiences of her life in service of military education. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "I would consider that an honor, Colonel Blake," Sarah replied, and there was something in her tone that suggested forgiveness, that indicated an understanding that people could grow and change even after decades of set patterns. "But I have one condition." Blake nodded immediately, clearly prepared to agree to anything she might ask. "Of course, Lieutenant. Name it." "I want Sergeant Rodriguez's story told alongside mine," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "I want every officer who hears about that day to understand that my survival came at the cost of a good man's life, and that the medals and recognition I received belong as much to him as they do to me." Her eyes met his directly, and Blake saw in them the kind of moral clarity that comes only from having faced the ultimate test of character. If we're going to talk about sacrifice and courage, we need to talk about all of it. The victories and the losses. The heroes who came home and the ones who didn't. Colonel Blake nodded solemnly, understanding that he was being offered something far more valuable than just a training opportunity. He was being offered a chance at redemption, an opportunity to learn from someone whose understanding of military values ran deeper than his own, despite her junior rank. "Agreed, Lieutenant. Sergeant Rodriguez's sacrifice will be honored appropriately." As the morning sun climbed higher and the last of the watching soldiers disappeared back to their duties, the three officers stood in the courtyard, Sarah, Colonel Blake, and Major Hendricks, each processing the morning's events in their own way. The formal proceedings were over, the apologies had been made, and the accommodations had been approved. But everyone present understood that what had happened here was about more than just training modifications or military protocol. It was about the recognition that true strength sometimes comes disguised as vulnerability, that the greatest warriors aren't always the ones who shout the loudest or stand the tallest, and that sometimes the most profound lessons about courage and sacrifice come from the most unexpected sources. Sarah Martinez had not just won an accommodation for her training needs. She had fundamentally changed how everyone on that base would think about strength, service, and the hidden costs of military heroism. 6 months later, the same courtyard that had witnessed Colonel Blake's public humiliation of Lieutenant Martinez had been transformed into something entirely different. A small bronze plaque now marked the spot where Sarah had revealed her scars, dedicated to all those who bear hidden wounds in service to their country. The inscription included Sergeant Michael Rodriguez's name prominently displayed, along with the names of the 11 soldiers Sarah had saved that October day in Afghanistan. The weekly officer development sessions that had grown out of that morning's confrontation had become the most requested training program on the base. Sarah stood before a packed auditorium every Thursday morning, no longer hiding her compression gloves or the slight stiffness in her movements. Instead, she wore them, like badges of honor, visible reminders of the price that some soldiers pay for their service. Her presentations weren't just about tactics and leadership theory. They were about the weight of command decisions, the responsibility that comes with leading others into harm's way, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come at the highest personal costs. Colonel Blake had undergone his own transformation during those 6 months. The arrogant, dismissive officer who had once mocked what he perceived as weakness had evolved into something his subordinates had never seen before. A leader who listened more than he spoke, who sought to understand rather than to judge, and who had learned to recognize strength in all its varied forms. He attended every one of Sarah's sessions, always sitting in the front row, taking notes with the dedication of a first-year cadet. The change in him hadn't gone unnoticed by the base personnel. His legendary temper had been replaced by a thoughtful consideration of circumstances before passing judgment. His quick dismissal of soldiers' concerns had given way to careful investigation of the facts behind their requests. The man who had once prided himself on never showing weakness now openly admitted when he didn't understand something, when he needed to learn more, when he had made mistakes that required correction. On this particular Thursday morning, as Sarah concluded her presentation about maintaining unit cohesion under extreme stress, a young second lieutenant raised her hand from the back of the auditorium. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "how do you deal with the guilt? The knowledge that your decisions led to someone's death, even when you know you made the best choice possible with the information you had?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and everyone in the room could see the way Sarah's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around the podium. This was the question that came up in every session, asked in different ways by different people, but always carrying the same weight of moral complexity that haunted every combat leader. "Second Lieutenant Chen," Sarah replied, having learned the names of every regular attendee. "That's the question that keeps me awake some nights, even 3.5 years later." She stepped away from the podium, moving closer to her audience, with the measured gait that spoke of old injuries and ongoing pain. The guilt doesn't go away. It changes, it evolves. Sometimes it lessens, but it never completely disappears. And I've come to believe that's how it should be. She paused, her eyes scanning the faces in the auditorium. Young officers who had never seen combat, seasoned veterans who carried their own invisible scars, senior leaders who understood the weight of command responsibility. "Sergeant Rodriguez died because of my decision to take that route through the valley. That's a fact I can't change, no matter how many tactical analyses prove it was the right choice given our intelligence at the time. But 11 other soldiers lived because I chose to keep fighting despite my injuries. That's also a fact, Colonel." Blake leaned forward in his seat, his notebook forgotten as he listened to words that had become both familiar and profound over the past months. He had heard Sarah give this answer dozens of times, but it never failed to impact him. The simple acknowledgement that leadership meant carrying the weight of both successes and failures, that strength meant accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond one's complete control. "The guilt," Sarah continued, "reminds me that every decision I make as an officer has consequences for real people with real families who are counting on them to come home. It keeps me humble, keeps me careful, keeps me focused on the fact that leadership isn't about being right all the time. It's about making the best possible decisions with incomplete information and then living with the results, good and bad." A movement near the door caught Sarah's attention, and she paused mid-sentence as she recognized the figure standing quietly in the back of the auditorium. Maria Rodriguez, Sergeant Michael Rodriguez's widow, had been attending these sessions for the past 2 months, usually slipping in after they had begun and leaving before the formal conclusion. Sarah had never approached her directly, understanding instinctively that the woman needed to process her grief and find her own path to whatever peace might be possible. But today was different. Today, Maria Rodriguez walked down the center aisle of the auditorium, her steps sure and purposeful, carrying something wrapped in military-issued cloth. The entire room fell silent as she approached the front, and Sarah felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of anxiety and hope. "Lieutenant Martinez," Maria said when she reached the front of the room, her voice clear and steady despite the obvious emotion behind her words. "I've been listening to your presentations for weeks now, hearing you talk about my husband, about that day, about the guilt you carry." She paused, her dark eyes meeting Sarah's directly. "I think it's time you heard something that might help. You carry that burden a little differently." Sarah's hands had begun to tremble again, the compression gloves doing nothing to hide the nervous energy that always surfaced when she was confronted with reminders of that October day. Around the auditorium, officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they were about to witness something profoundly personal and significant. Maria carefully unwrapped the cloth bundle she carried, revealing a thick folder filled with letters, photographs, and official documents. "These are letters that Michael wrote but never sent," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Letters to his family, to his friends, to his soldiers, and to his commanding officers. He wrote them during quiet moments in the barracks, during guard duty, whenever he had thoughts he needed to express but didn't know how to say out loud." She opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, yellowed slightly with age, and bearing the distinctive handwriting that Sarah remembered from countless reports and requisition forms. "This one is dated 3 days before the convoy mission," Maria continued. "He wrote it after you led that night patrol that rescued those 2 Marines who had gotten separated from their unit during a sandstorm." Maria began to read, her husband's words carrying across the silent auditorium like a voice from beyond the grave. "Lieutenant Martinez is the kind of officer who makes you believe in the system again. She doesn't ask us to do anything she wouldn't do herself, doesn't hide behind her rank when things get dangerous. Today, she risked her own life to bring home 2 Marines who weren't even under her command, just because it was the right thing to do. If something happens to me over here, I hope it's while serving under someone like her, someone who understands that leadership means putting your people first, no matter what." The silence that followed was profound and complete. Several officers in the audience were openly weeping, and even Colonel Blake had removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Sarah stood frozen at the front of the room, her own tears falling freely, for the first time since she had returned from Afghanistan. But Maria wasn't finished. She pulled out another letter, this one bearing a more recent date. "This one he wrote the night before the convoy mission," she said, her own voice now thick with emotion. "The night before he died, saving lives and serving his country under the command of an officer he respected and trusted completely." She read again. "Tomorrow, we're escorting supplies to Chapman. It's a dangerous route, but Lieutenant Martinez has planned everything carefully, studied the intelligence, positioned our support assets perfectly. If something goes wrong, I know she'll get us through it. She's the kind of leader who would die before she'd abandon her soldiers, and that makes me proud to serve under her command. Maria, if you're reading this, know that I died serving alongside the finest officer I've ever known, and that any sacrifice I made was made willingly in service to something greater than myself." The letter fluttered in Maria's hands as she folded it carefully, her own tears now falling onto the paper that carried her husband's final thoughts. "Lieutenant Martinez," she said, looking up at Sarah with eyes that held pain but also something deeper. Understanding, perhaps, or even gratitude. "Michael knew the risks. He chose to serve under your command because he trusted your leadership, your judgment, your commitment to bringing everyone home safely. His death wasn't your failure. It was his willing sacrifice in service to his brothers and sisters in arms." Sarah could no longer maintain her military composure. The tears that she had held back for 3.5 years finally broke free. Not the silent tears of private grief, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone finally allowing themselves to feel the full weight of loss and guilt and responsibility. But mixed with the grief was something else. A lightening of the burden she had carried alone for so long, a sharing of the weight that made it somehow more bearable. Maria Rodriguez stepped forward and did something that no one in the auditorium would ever forget. She embraced Sarah Martinez, the woman whose tactical decisions had led to her husband's death, holding her as she wept for the soldier who had died under her command. It was a moment of forgiveness and understanding that transcended military rank, personal loss, and the complex calculus of war and sacrifice. "He would want you to forgive yourself, Lieutenant," Maria whispered, her words barely audible but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent auditorium. "He would want you to understand that his sacrifice meant something because it was made in service to someone worthy of that sacrifice. Don't dishonor his memory by carrying guilt that he wouldn't want you to bear." When Sarah finally composed herself enough to speak, Her words came out in a broken whisper that nonetheless carried clearly through the room's perfect acoustics. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for giving me the gift of knowing that he trusted me, that he understood what we were fighting for, that his sacrifice was made willingly in service to something he believed in." Colonel Blake rose from his seat and began to applaud, slowly. At first, then with increasing intensity as every person in the auditorium joined him. It wasn't the polite applause of a completed presentation, but the deep, respectful recognition of courage in all its forms. Sarah's courage in leading under impossible circumstances. Maria's courage in finding forgiveness and understanding. Michael's courage in making the ultimate sacrifice for his fellow soldiers. As the applause finally died away and the session formally concluded, people began to file out of the auditorium with unusual quietness, each processing what they had, witnessed in their own way. But 3 people remained: Sarah, Maria, and Colonel Blake, each understanding that they had been part of something that would change them forever. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Colonel Blake said as he approached the 2 women, his voice carrying a humility that his subordinates had learned to respect over the past months. "Would you be willing to continue attending these sessions? I think there are lessons in what you've shared today that could benefit every leader on this base." Maria Rodriguez looked at Sarah, then back at the colonel, her decision already made. "Yes," she said simply. Michael believed that his service meant something, that his sacrifice was part of something larger than himself. If sharing his words and his memory can help other leaders understand the weight of their responsibilities to their soldiers, then yes, I'll continue coming. And so the weekly sessions continued, but now they included not just the tactical and leadership lessons that Sarah had learned through fire and blood, but also the perspective of military families, the understanding of sacrifice that extended beyond the battlefield, and the recognition that true strength often comes from the most unexpected sources, from scarred hands that still salute, from widows who choose forgiveness over bitterness, and from colonels who have learned that leadership means admitting when you're wrong and growing from your mistakes. The bronze plaque in the courtyard had been right. They were all people who bore hidden wounds in service to their country, but they had learned that those wounds, when shared and understood, could become sources of strength rather than shame, bonds that connected them to something larger than their individual pain, and reminders that the price of freedom is always paid by someone, and that someone deserves to be honored, remembered, and understood. In the end, the morning that Colonel Blake had mocked Lieutenant Martinez's excuse had become the beginning of a transformation that touched every person on the base. It had shown them that true military bearing isn't about hiding weakness, but about carrying strength in all its forms, visible and invisible, personal and shared, individual and collective. And it had taught them that sometimes the most profound military lessons come not from textbooks or training manuals, but from the courage to reveal our scars and the wisdom to understand that healing, like leadership, is something we do together.